The current manner in which activism is done does not aid in conservation efforts, but in fact impedes development of sustainable systems. Now hold on, eager activists. I'm not some climate change denying politician here to ruin your day. I'm simply performing a little thought experiment. Let's start with this. This conference was built upon the ideas of critical thinking communities, or CTCs. What are CTCs? Well, instead of giving a long-winded definition, how about I show you? One of the base skills of critical thought is analysis of one's own thinking patterns. So let's do just that. Let's think about how we think. Odd, yes, but this is a critical aspect of higher order thinking, so bear with me for a moment. I'm sure you remember the statement made earlier, right? Now I'm sure you've got an opinion already primed since the moment you heard it. Assessing and interpreting information as quickly as possible is a vital skill, and your personal lens is the only window you have to frame the world, so obviously it's going to be used. However, if we don't take a moment every now and then to stop and reassess the woodwork of those frames, we can rush forward with incomplete ideas. So, how do we assess that frame? Take a moment to look back at how you think. Remove yourself from your own skin and don't be afraid to give yourself a thorough criticism. Why did you respond to the statement how you did? If it made you angry, are you angry because you found a fallacy in that statement? Or because you've unconsciously found a fallacy in yourself? Are you uncomfortable yet? Good. Finding and acknowledging the flaws in our own ways of thinking, as uncomfortable as it may be, gives us the opportunity to buff them out and refine our lens. Christopher Hitchens said it best. The essence of the independent mind lies not in what it thinks, but in how it thinks. So, hopefully I've properly introduced the concept behind this event. This is not about how to cope with industries turning our green into their gold, nor arguing over lawmakers with Ben Franklin stuffed in their ears. This is about us, our lives, our lifestyles, and our own thoughts. Bring your own brain. Welcome back, everyone, to Bring Your Own Brain, a symposium to free us from climate chaos. My name is Everett. I'll be one of your MCs today. I'll do a quick run through our itinerary for today and tomorrow. We have an international, after George, we have an international CTC with students from Sweden. And tomorrow we had we had reserved for our discussion and our workshop for critical thinking communities. We've actually moved a speaker into that slot. His name's Joseph Grady. He'll be Brady. I'm sorry. He'll be giving a speech where that time was supposed to be given for CTCs. And then at the end of the day, we'll have our CTC discussion, which we hope all of you will come to, which we think is the most important part of the symposium. So without further ado, we're going to get right along here and talk about our first speaker. And to do that is Pression.
Mr. Monbiot is a world-traveling investigative journalist turned activist and author. He dedicates himself to fighting environmental destruction, inequality, and the libertarianism which grants freedom to the powerful at the expense of the powerless. He has published several books, including Captive State, The Corporate Takeover of Britain, Heat, How to Stop the Planet Burning, and Feral, Searching for Enchantment on the Frontiers of Rewilding. He currently writes a weekly column for The Guardian.
Well, thanks very much, everyone, and it's great to be talking to you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm talking to you from a nation that is now buoyant with hope. 6 weeks ago, it seemed like a pretty grim place. The Conservatives had called an election which they seemed destined not just to win, but to win by a massive majority, and that would enable them to then sweep through the hardest of all possible breaks with the European Union, ripping down environmental regulations, ripping down worker protections, ripping down consumer protections, ripping down all the public protections which make the difference between a good society and barbarism. The Labour Party, by contrast, which for the first time in several decades is now led by someone who actually believes in genuine Labour principles, someone who could fairly be called a socialist or a social democrat, that seemed to be in a hopeless position. The general understanding of Jeremy Corbyn and his party was that they were all over the place, that they were chaotic, that they would make a calamitous showing in the election, and the Conservatives would win by at least 100 seats, possibly by more. Well, it happened in a way that seems almost miraculous. It's the fastest turnaround in British political history, possibly in the democratic history of the world, what has happened in this country. And while Jeremy Corbyn was not very strong in opposition, he was not very good at taking the battle to the government, as soon as his propositional programme, his manifesto, his platform was leaked to the media in an attempt to sabotage it, incidentally, people immediately began to see, wait a minute, this is what we've always wanted. This is what we've been calling for. He's promising a country which is going to work for everybody. A country which is going to distribute the great wealth that we've got in this nation. A country which is going to protect the poor and the weak and the natural world against the destructive tendencies of the rich and powerful. A country which is going to defend our health service, defend our education service, invest in them properly, ensure that no one falls through the cracks. And everything began to shift at lightning speed. I mean, it's hard to convey the sense of shock and astonishment that this election has caused. Sure, technically, the Conservatives won it. They got more seats, but only just, and not enough to form a government by themselves. They lost a considerable number of seats to Labour and are now in total disarray. They're tearing each other apart, they're tearing the whole party apart, whereas Labour is now this powerful, resurgent force which looks irresistible. And it's using not just the power of being able to connect with people with positive policies, and this is absolutely crucial in anything we do. We've got to have a positive programme, but it's also been using the techniques of political organising pioneered by the Sanders campaign in the US. And we know how Bernie went from 3% name recognition and being considered to be this total no-hoper, way out on the extreme political fringe, no one's going to vote for him, to capturing 46% of the delegates in the attempt to win the Democratic nomination, and was it 22 or 23 states? An amazing turnaround. Again, he didn't quite make it, but it just began to hint at what the potential was of this mass organising model through networks, sort of dendritic networks of volunteers, and that was a model which was also adopted by the Labour Party. And it now looks fairly clear in the UK that our government is going to collapse very soon. There's likely to be another general election before long, and if that's the case, Labour will sweep it. And we will be in a completely different position in this country with regards to, well, everything we care about, with regards to climate change, with regards to wider environmental protections, with regards to the protection of all the people at the bottom of society who believed it was their destiny to be ground into dust. And the two key changes, which I've mentioned before, but I'd really like to emphasise, are one, going out to meet the opposition with a positive programme of your own. If you are a purely oppositional movement, if your sole message is we want to stop what you are doing, we hate what you're doing, we want to stop it, and we want to try to roll it back, well, you are allowing your program to be set by your opposition. The agenda is being set by them. The moment you produce something which connects with people, they then have to respond to you. You end up setting the agenda. And the second thing is this mass distributed organizing, which doesn't depend on big money, but depends on large numbers of highly committed volunteers. Now, I believe we could take both those things a step further, and that this is a crucial lesson, not just within political campaigning of trying to win elections, but within specific campaigns, particularly on issues such as climate change. And the first thing we need to do is not just to come up with a new platform, a new specific political program of policies, but a whole new political narrative. And I think this is the crucial thing that has been missing from all progressive politics for far too long, which is to set the agenda not just in terms of policy, but in terms of deep underlying narrative. Now, story in politics is absolutely crucial, because story is the means by which we make sense of the world. We consider ourselves to be rational actors. We look at where our own self-interest lies, and we add up the costs on one side and the benefits on the other, and like a calculating machine, we then decide what we ought to do as a result of that balance of costs and benefits. But that's not at all how we behave. That's the economist's model of how people behave, which doesn't bear any relationship whatsoever to what we're really like. We're not like that at all. We're highly emotional creatures, and we make sense of the world through emotional narrative means. The sense we're looking for is what could be described as narrative sense. Does this make sense in terms of the story with which I'm familiar? Does it fit in? Does it progress from A to B to C in the way that I would expect it to progress? We're not looking for Enlightenment rationality, for scientific rationality, for mathematical rationality. When we try to make sense of the world, we're looking for narrative rationality. And unless as a political movement we're able to tell a story that makes sense to people, we're always going to find ourselves reactively fighting against other people's stories. And at the moment there are two stories which dominate all politics almost everywhere, and they are both 20th century stories which have somehow found their way into the 21st century, where they really don't belong. And the first one of these was the one which we broadly describe as social democracy, and was really consolidated as a coherent doctrine in the 20th century by John Maynard Keynes. Now, Keynes was responding to the horrendous events of the Great Depression, caused by the laissez-faire ideology of Victorian and Edwardian economists, with disastrous consequences for the great majority of the population, but wonderful consequences for the robber barons who lived in a Gilded Age, as we know. And he produced this something which was not just an economic program, but it was really a whole new story of how society worked and how it ought to work. And his story followed the basic narrative structure which works in politics again and again and again. And that narrative structure is really, well, it's the Lord of the Rings story. It says this, it says, the land has fallen into disorder as a result of the action of nefarious forces. We, the heroes of the story, which might be a small group of people, it might be an entire class, it might be most of a nation, fight those nefarious forces against overwhelming odds, overthrow them, win, and restore order to the land. And Keynes took this basic story, this very, very old narrative, it's millennia old, this story, and he said, right, the land has fallen into disorder as a result of the greed of the robber barons and the plutocrats who caused the Great Depression. And this has caused horrendous impacts for so many people. We, the heroes of the story, who are the sort of combined weight of the middle and working classes, in that case, are going to fight these plutocrats, overthrow them, and restore order to the land in the form of a paternalistic state, which will then which will collectivize wealth and redistribute it through investing in great public services and other really useful public investments. That will then generate wealth, which will generate economic growth, driving consumer demand, which then drives more economic growth, and off we go. And it worked tremendously well, particularly during what the French call the Trente Glorieuses, between 1945 and 1975. Well, then it ran into big trouble. It hit the buffers in the 1970s, and for all sorts of reasons, and along came the neoliberals. And they had their own story. And these were people like Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman, and many others who had, for the past 30 years, from the mid-1940s, been building a sort of neoliberal international, a group spanning the world, who had been calling for basically the destruction of most of the protective functions of government. Massive deregulation, massive destruction of trade unions, massive destruction of tax receipts, particularly from the rich, privatization, outsourcing, basically the dismantling of most of the functions of the state, which are there to try to protect the poorer and weaker members of society from the trampling of the plutocrats. And they said, well, all that must go in the name of freedom. They were very careful not to specify freedom for whom, against whom, because of course the freedoms they were talking about was freedoms of the rich to exploit the poor, freedoms of the banks to exploit society, freedoms of corporations to exploit their workers, freedom of landlords to exploit their tenants, etc., etc. These are the neoliberal freedoms. And the story they told was very similar to, in terms of structure, narrative structure, to the story that John Maynard Keynes told, but with completely the opposite message. And it said, the land has fallen into disorder as a result of the collectivizing tendencies of the overmighty state. And this is crushing individuality, this is crushing human freedom, and we, this small band of heroic entrepreneurs, are going to overthrow that state and restore order in the form of the free market, uninhibited by taxation, by regulation, and the rest of it. Well, we saw what happened to that model in 2008. That just exploded. It completely fell apart. But the problem was then that no one came up with a new story with which to replace it. And all we've got, and even in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour and Bernie Sanders's attempt to win the Democratic nomination, even then, wonderful as those were, they're basically propounding an old 20th century story going back to Keynesianism. But not really Keynesianism, just a couple of thin chapters from the Keynesian story, which is deficit spending, stimulus spending to try to restart economic growth, interest rate manipulations, and investment in the public realm. But none of the capital controls, foreign exchange controls, international clearing union, and all those other essential elements which Keynes saw as crucial to make his system work. The problem lies not just in the fact that the issues which brought down Keynesianism in the 1970s are still there, they have not gone away. Not just in the fact that those who call themselves Keynesians today aren't really Keynesians, for the reasons I've just spelt out, but also, most crucially, because a program whose purpose is to sustain steady rates of economic growth is directly at odds with the protection of the living world. It worked just fine when you imagined that the planet was infinite, when you imagined that infinite expansion was possible. It's a total disaster when we know that the planet is a finite resource and that infinite growth on this finite resource is bound to lead to the breaching of planetary boundaries, left, right, and centre. So we need a new story. not just because a new story is required to galvanize and excite people across the political spectrum, but also because the old stories are unmatched to the great predicaments that we face in the 21st century, particularly climate change. And I think there is a great new story to be told, which fits that highly effective, highly successful narrative structure, the narrative structure which always seems to work in politics. And that goes like this. The land has fallen into disorder. We human beings have fallen into disorder because we're not able to be the extraordinary creatures that we really are. The story that we're told by neoliberals and other nefarious forces is that we live in a Hobbesian world, or a fight, as Thomas Hobbes said in 1651, of every man against every man, and that the inherent state of human nature is one in which life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutal, and short. Well, you can understand why Hobbes believed that in 1651, just after the English Civil War, in which 1/3 of the men in England had been killed. And his understanding of evolutionary biology was confined to the book of Genesis, and he believed in the doctrine of original sin. But today, that belief is just impossible to sustain. If you know anything about neuroscience, psychology, social sciences, anthropology, ethnography, evolutionary biology, they all converge on the same conclusions, which, as a paper in the journal Frontiers in Psychology remarks, shows that human beings are spectacularly unusual by comparison to other animals. Well, of course, we are in all sorts of ways, but what they're talking about is in our degree of altruism. We are phenomenally altruistic and empathetic by comparison to any other animal species on Earth, quite remarkably so. But the story we've been told again and again and again is that we are just the opposite. We are self-maximizing, we try to grab all we can. Economists have got a term for this, homo economicus, grasping people who just elbow everyone else out the way to pursue their own self-interest. It's simply not how we work, and experiment after experiment shows that we innately are inclined to mutual aid, to mutual reliance, to selflessness, in our dealings with other people, to altruism, to kindness, to generosity with those people. But that state of human nature has been thrown into disorder by this neoliberal doctrine, which celebrates extreme individualism and competition, says that this is a good thing because it discerns who the righteous winners are and the rightful losers are, and creates a natural hierarchy which we should celebrate, and we should be delighted with this hierarchy, and we should do nothing to disrupt it, and has created this inspiring lexicon of soul traders and lone rangers and self-made men and women, and where we absorb and internalize and reproduce this doctrine in our own hearts until we come to believe that if we're at the bottom of society, we deserve to be there. And those billionaires are the wealth creators, and they deserve to be there, and they're good for us. It's good that we have such levels of inequality because that wealth is going to trickle down. And all of these stories have persuaded us that we are really selfish, highly competitive people. We've come to believe that, and as a result, we start to behave in that way. But we, the heroes of the story, are going to restore order to the land, and we do so by rediscovering these extraordinary capacities we have in us, and in doing so, creating a politics of belonging. A politics based once more on community, on working together, rebuilding our physical, local, geographical communities, rebuilding communities of interest and action across the world, rebuilding a politics which belongs to us rather than to the plutocratic elite, rebuilding an economics which belongs to us and which lives within the constraints of the living world. I think Kate Rayworth's book, Donut Economics, is the clearest and best exposition of how we can do that, and brings us back into the center of the story, not us alone as people living in splendid isolation, but as us as the thing that we are best at. People who stand together against their common threats. People who establish and discover common purpose in doing so. And people who create community, the community which is going to change the world. And I believe that this new political narrative could be highly effective everywhere we take it. And within that narrative, we can embed the particular issues that interest us and show how they work towards a politics of belonging, which, well, almost everyone can subscribe to, because actually that's what almost everyone craves, is a sense of belonging to community. Not an exclusive community, not one that says you're out because you're the wrong race, you're the wrong sex, whatever it might be, but a community which can absorb and incorporate anyone who wants to be part of it, and to allow that community to then enrich your life, paradoxically to allow you to become more self-reliant, and can then help you through your dynamic connections with other people to change your neighborhood, change your state, change your nation, and change the world. And this, I believe, is how we're going to fight this dreadful predicament of climate breakdown alongside all the other mind-crushing problems that we face. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. Let's try and get the camera here set up. So if you don't mind, we'll take a few minutes to maybe have some questions and answers, and I'll just have people start kind of lining up over here, and really appreciate your comments. The students are very excited to work with you. You know, we've been working on this project now for a year, and meeting every Sunday and reading your work, and you gave a nice plug for Kate, who's going to be speaking tomorrow morning. So some of the audience was like, oh, wow, that's on the agenda. So well done. And I didn't even pay you to say it. So yeah, I'll go ahead, and the people are kind of filing up here right now to take questions. And again, I thank you very much for taking the time, and I'll hand it off to the first person. All right, thank you. Go ahead. Here's one of our speakers.
Lovely.
Hi, George. I really loved your talk, particularly the last part about the sociality of human nature, which I think I'm completely in agreement with it. But I wondered if you could offer any speculations or opinions about what explains the failure of Keynesianism, why neoliberalism came into being, and whether it is possible at all, you know, to bring back Keynesianism. You never used the word capitalism. And I wonder your view of the society that we should can form, if we do it right, how that relates to capitalism or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the first thing to say on that, if you don't mind me starting at the end of your questions, is that Keynesianism is a form of capitalism. Keynesianism and neoliberalism are two forms of capitalism, or at least they incorporate forms of capitalism and engage with forms of capitalism, even though they are very different ones. But as Kate will doubtless be explaining in greater depth tomorrow, what they tend to do is to focus on fairly narrow aspects of the economy. They talk a lot about the state and about the market. One of them likes the state and is sort of neutral towards the market. The other one hates the state and loves the market. But those are the only two spheres they really recognize as important. Missing out the household, and this is one of the reasons why women's work is so undervalued, because the household is not recognized as a crucial component of the economy. There's a wonderful book, by the way, called what is it called? It's about Adam Smith's mother, and sort of showing how he couldn't possibly have written his books if it weren't for the invisible hands of his mother doing all his cooking and cleaning and making his bed and ironing his clothes and all the rest of it, none of which was recognized at all. But then there's a fourth sector, a crucial economic sector, which is the commons, which I would describe clearly as a non-capitalist sector. And the commons is not just the resources which we might share in common, which might be a piece of land or a stretch of water or a pasture or a forest, or they might be the internet, or they might be some free software or open source software, as it should really properly be called. But they're also the community of people that uses that resource and the rules which that community creates to manage that resource. And those three elements are together create the commons. And like Kate, I believe that there's scope for a massive expansion of the commons, and that this should form a far greater part of our economy than it does today. And this is something we manage mutually. Cooperatives can be seen as a form of commons, and we manage it for our general social benefit rather than the benefit of one or two capitalists who extract all the wealth that other people generate. And so that's got to be, in my view, a crucial component of it, and it knits very nicely with the idea of rebuilding community in this wider politics of belonging. Now, can Keynesianism be revived? Well, I believe there are elements of Keynesianism which remain essential and can live alongside a new politics, and those in particular are a rich investment in the public realm. And so that means great public health services free at the point of use, great public education services free at the point of use, great museums, great art galleries, a great welfare state which stops people from falling through the net. There are a lot of things we can do which are definitely part of the Keynesian story, but by themselves don't really amount to fully fledged Keynesianism. So I'm not suggesting we throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think there's really good elements that we should try to preserve. Now, why did it run into trouble in the 1970s? Well, fundamentally, because the sort of global plutocratic class found ways of getting round it. They found ways of undermining it, and that was in particular the destruction of capital controls and foreign exchange controls. And the problem is that they are so well versed in that, it's very hard to see how they could be persuaded to unlearn the lessons which they applied so successfully in the 1970s. But there were also some innate endogenous problems with Keynesianism, and those come down to sort of technical things like cost push inflation and stagflation. I won't go into it all now, but it ran into a whole series of issues which it found very difficult to deal with. There's also the issue that it's 80 years old, and isn't it time that we created our own story and didn't rely on one so old, one which inherently is perhaps going to be less inspiring than something new that is tailored specifically to the demands of the 21st century and built specifically with our environmental crisis in mind? Because even with the best will in the world, at the very heart of Keynesianism is this idea of keeping economic growth going through stimulus spending, and that is inherently incompatible with trying to protect the living world.
Hi, George. Thanks so much for being with us today. Last week, on an article you wrote about labor, you said that the election now hangs on whether the young people who claim they will vote labor are prepared to act on this intention. And I was just wondering, as a recent graduate or a high school graduate from the United States, I was wondering if it is worth my time and other youth in the United States to participate in a system that is corrupt and illegitimate. And if we simply vote in the system, we're just legitimizing a broken system. And I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Thank you very much. Well, this is a highly pertinent question, just like the last one. The first thing I'd say is that it so much depends what you're voting for. It so much depends what you're participating in. If this were a choice between Hillary Clinton and Trump all over again, well, I still would have voted for Clinton, but with a heavy heart, because what she said didn't resonate with any of the things that I was looking for. She didn't seem to be able to connect with the deep issues which are troubling not just young people, but some of the greybeards like me as well. But Sanders, to have been part of the Sanders campaign, well, that was a thrilling and fantastic thing to do, because that was genuinely attempting to overthrow the crushing power structures that destroy aspiration, that destroy the prospects of a better world. And exactly the same applies to Corbyn in the United Kingdom, where he has stood all of his life, just like Bernie, he has stood for trying to overthrow those power structures, to release the human potential for a better life, and particularly now for younger people, because on both sides of the Atlantic we see a stitch up by rich older people against the interests of everyone else, against the interests of other older people, but also in particular against the interests of young people who are basically paying for the whole current system to carry on the way it is. They're paying through rent, they're paying through interest payments, which are another form of rent, by the way. They're paying through all sorts of inflated costs passed down onto them by the oligarchs who run the world. And I believe it's not just a question of whether we should participate in the system or not. I think we have a moral duty to ourselves and to others, young or old. We have this duty to try to overthrow that system in order to release ourselves and others from it. So it's not just should we, shouldn't we? We must engage, but we must engage with the people who can offer that hope, rather than the people who crush hope, like Hillary Clinton on your side of the Atlantic and Tony Blair on my side of the Atlantic, who just echo and reflect the neoliberal agenda of their opponents.
Thank you.
Hi, George. I'm John from California. I'm a scholar activist in the global climate justice movement, my passion. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that was very profound about the new story. And I'm quite interested in the sort of actors that are going to carry that story forward together. And both on the social movement level, where I spend a lot of time, the climate justice movement, trying to move that, with other movements in the same direction, or a direction that they choose, but also on the political level. And I talk about, very hypothetically, what we need is not another party, we need a new kind of party, whatever that might be. So my question is, do you see glimpses or hints of that either in the social movement sphere or the party political sphere, and what suggestions might you have for actors coming together to do this?
Thank you very much, John. Thanks. I think it's already happening, and it's happening in strange places because it's happening within the structures of the big existing parties. I don't know if you've come across this book by Becky Bond and Zach Exley called Rules for Revolutionaries. Have you read that? Has anyone else in the audience read that? Has anyone read that? It's a really inspiring book. It's not a great book in that it's not particularly well written. It's quite repetitive. It could have been half the length. But it's basically the inside story of how the Sanders campaign built its volunteer network. And in building it, they built the basis of what would have been a whole new political party, still called the Democratic Party. It would have had the same name, but it would have been utterly different to the Democratic Party we now know, which is this sort of very top-down, hierarchical, controlled party dominated by big donors, dominated by the Beltway consensus, which creates very little space for genuine Democrats. I mean, Democrats with a small d, genuine Democrats like yourself, like most of the people I'm sure in this room, who want a fully representative, ideally participatory political party that can actually be the vehicle for our hopes and dreams and desires, as opposed to just those of the Wall Street plutocrats and the lobbyists in Washington. And I think he's still at it, Bernie, and he's still pushing for that, and I think eventually his politics will transform the Democratic Party, just as Jeremy Corbyn's have already transformed the Labour Party. And what Corbyn has done here is a thrilling example, because basically he's increased the membership by more than 10 times, and this is just the beginning. You know, it's just growing and growing and growing, and it's being driven, the whole thing, not from party headquarters, but from this completely disaggregated volunteer network operating often quite independently all over the country, building the party they want to see. And that force has proved unstoppable, and God knows the party hierarchy tried to stop it. The Labour Party National Executive Committee, the Parliamentary Labour Party, they were desperate to stop that. They said, wait a minute, this party belongs to us. Who are these usurpers coming along and taking it from us? And the usurper said, bog off, this is ours now. We're in charge, and they have taken charge. It's almost an anarchist revolution within the Labour Party, and it's an extraordinary thing that's happened. And so I would say that the Labour Party in Britain is now a new party. It's got the same name. Some of the people in it are the same people as before, but to all intents and purposes, it functions and operates in a completely different way. And the leading characters in it are a completely different cast of characters. And so I think I can say from the perspective of the UK, your wish has come true.
Yeah, I think that's great. Just a quick follow-up is to say that I agree with that analysis of Corbyn, and I wish it were so in the US as well, of course. I think it's a much more difficult struggle. And just as you said, maybe we need a new name for the story than social democracy. I'd like to see a new name than the Democratic Party. But I think the way you describe doing it is one thing worth considering. But I think it needs the social movements pushing them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Hi, George. My name's Dave. I was wondering if in this new story we can still rely on markets and the mechanism of pricing to relay information about actual cost. My concern really is about the externalized costs and how we ever come to that realization of actual cost.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm very glad you brought this up. Now, I won't talk too long on this because I know Kate will do a much better job tomorrow on talking about this very question, because she's extremely hot on this, as she is on many issues. She's really great, and I think you're going to get a lot from her talk, and I'd strongly recommend you all to attend it. But broadly speaking, of course, you're absolutely right. Everything that really matters in life is considered by economics to be an externality. All the damage we're doing to the living world is just an externality. All the damage we do to the people who fall through the cracks is an externality. The mental health crisis, much of which, according to Paul Verhaeghe in his brilliant book, What About Me, which I strongly recommend, is caused by neoliberalism. That's just an externality. It's all externalities, and none of these are accounted for by the market. And in this respect, the market is completely dysfunctional, because the price signal is not there. These things are not being marked by the price signal. They just simply do not exist. They're in the blank space within which the economic, on top of which the economic diagrams are drawn. And so we need a wholly new economics, which recognizes the economy as belonging to the entire sphere of human and more than human interactions, which is a subset of the biosphere, a subset of human society, and finds its place within it, and as Kate will explain, has a positive purpose of actually improving our lives without breaching those planetary boundaries. And I feel that while she doesn't have all the answers, she's made an excellent start in starting to sketch out how we can do that, not by discarding the market, but by re-recruiting it as just one element of a much wider economy. It's no longer going to be a market economy or a non-market economy, but the market, it can fit in there, alongside the state, alongside the commons, alongside the household, embedded within energy flows, embedded within the biosphere.
Right, I'll look forward to that. Thank you.
Hi, George. My name is Kenny. I'm a member of the student group, too. I don't have my shirt, unfortunately, today. But I was just wondering, my question was, what led to Corbyn's win in the UK and Sanders' loss in the United States? Did he need the Sanders campaign to happen in order for his win in the United Kingdom, or was it some other factor of play, like the shorter election cycle and the snap election?
Sure. Well, the first thing to say is that actually Corbyn didn't win. The Tories still got a majority, but it wasn't an overall majority, and then I've got this thing we call a hung parliament here, which doesn't mean, unfortunately, that they've all been hung, which would probably be the best option, but in this case, what it means is that they have to govern with another party, and unfortunately, the party they've chosen to try to govern with are these raving fundamentalists who, the sort of people who see The Handmaid's Tale not as a dystopia but as a manifesto. You know, that's the sort of people that they're dealing with. The Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland are a very, very dangerous bunch, but it's inherently extremely unstable. And we have a system very different from yours. Basically, if the government can't hold its majority together, because we don't have a presidential system, it can only be sustained with a government majority. If it can't hold it together, that government collapses, there's a new general election. And that could happen at any time, really. It could happen in weeks, months, who knows. And if that's the case, that's the point at which it's very hard to see any outcome other than Labour just sweeping to possibly the biggest majority it's ever had. This is a really thrilling and amazing prospect. So, yes, there are several major differences. One is the extraordinarily centralising tendencies of the Democratic Party and the way it crushes internal opposition, because it's not, I've seen it described as being unlike almost any other party on earth, and the Republicans are the same. You've got a very peculiar system in the US in that you don't really have membership parties. You know, there is a membership, but it's nominal. It's not driven by the membership, and so as a result, the big donors can come in and drive it instead. And following Citizens United, those donors have got phenomenal power in the US, and the combination of a very weak internal democracy within the political parties and very strong power, plutocratic power, as a result of unlimited campaign funds and all the things that you can do with that, means it's much harder to shift in the US even than it is in the UK, which is also a highly dysfunctional system, but not as highly dysfunctional as the US system is. I mean, we're both wild outliers. You know, when you look at how other countries run their democracies, you know, they must look at us, the US and the UK, and say those people are completely mad. You know, what are they doing? This isn't democracy. This is crazy. There's all sorts of ways in which, on both sides of the Atlantic, we're just behaving in a completely weird way. You know, if you were to diagnose our political systems, you would say that they've got, you know, very acute personality disorder, because they claim to be one thing and they are in fact the complete opposite of that thing they claim to be. And in both countries, we've got an uphill struggle to achieve anything resembling functioning democracy. But because our system isn't quite as crazy as your system, it's only 90% as crazy as your system, it's a little bit easier to get that breakthrough moment. But I strongly believe that it's coming in the US. I really believe it's coming. You know, Bernie is still there. His volunteer network is still there. Elizabeth Warren is still there. That is, all that stuff is building and building as Trump, just like Theresa May, is falling apart, visibly falling apart in front of us, even faster than we could have imagined. So I think, you know, in the medium to long term in the US, things are looking really amazing. You've got enormous prospects, great potential for hope there.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, George. My name's Will. Thank you for, here you are, for joining us. And for being someone who challenges people's assumptions. I'm someone who's spent 700 days in the wilderness areas around here in the last 7 years, hanging out with young folks, trying to get them to talk and to do physical labor, and appreciate how dependent we are on the labor of people all over the world. We heard from Derek Jensen yesterday, someone who's frustrated with, maybe as a writer, the ways in which his very broad critique gets portrayed as the violence guy, as he put it. I have really appreciated your writing, particularly around nuclear areas, and I don't want to make you into the nuclear guy, but in reading you, and actually a colleague of yours, Lee Phillips, who I discovered through the Seriously Wrong podcast, I feel like I was hearing Derek in rich new ways yesterday, and much more critically, as a result of sort of this critique of eco-austerity. And I was wondering if you could speak to some of the ways in which the deep green movements, how people on the left are talking about technology maybe counters their ultimate goal of creating a inclusive left. I forget the word you used, but something that invites everyone to the table globally.
Thank you very much. Yes, so very interesting issues there, and it would probably take about 2 hours to answer that question properly, because there's so much, so many places we could go with that. But I mean, broadly speaking, my own inclinations are with deep ecology. I'm an ecologist by background. I got into all of this because of my love of the natural world. I'm campaigning for rewilding, and helped to found the group Rewilding Britain, and we're making strides now. Exciting stuff is happening. But I do feel I have to temper that with the recognition of where we are, and the recognition that at least 99% of people are not in any way deep ecologists. In fact, probably not any sort of ecologists at all, and really just don't know very much about the natural world, don't care all that much about the natural world, except in a sort of slightly vague and fuzzy way, and that we have to meet them, and we have to engage, and we have to find ways of organization which, as you say, are going to appeal to everyone, are going to work. People can see it working for them. And I think that community and community organization and community management of resources, that has got an awful long way to take us in terms of trying to solve some of our common predicaments, including our environmental predicaments. Because at the moment, we're in this position where we say, well, those guys have got all the resources, and those guys can therefore decide what to do with those resources, and we're powerless to affect that decision. And we internalize that powerlessness, and we reproduce that powerlessness and say, oh yeah, well, we can't do anything. Let them screw the planet, because it's not really our concern. We're trespassers on it. We're trespassers on the planet. That's how we're made to feel. And we have to reclaim that sense of political control, economic control, and ecological control. And I think by rebuilding community, and the great thing about that is that that cuts across traditional left and right. Everyone claims to be in favor of community. Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke wrote almost identical things about the value of community. It was about the only thing they agreed on. Everything else they might have disagreed on, but they agreed that community had to be the key to everything. And I think that by emphasizing this, by emphasizing a politics of belonging, you can easily build the environmental vision into that. Because you say, we belong to the planet, we belong to this particular corner of the planet, and in all sorts of deep ways, it belongs to us as well. There's the philosopher Kimberly Brownlee has identified 3 forms of belonging: belonging with, belonging to, and belonging in. And I think one can easily construct an environmental vision which makes use of all those 3 forms of belonging, and shows how we are a component of the biosphere. It's a lot bigger than we are, and we can't survive without it. We have to belong within it, we have to belong to it, and we have to belong inside it as well. We have to belong with it, to it, and in it. And if we can't see ourselves in that way, well, we can't sustain human civilization, because we then can't sustain the biosphere. And I think there is a story to be told which makes it a lot easier to get traction for environmental issues precisely while meeting people's genuine political and economic aspirations. Not the economic aspiration to own a super yacht or a private jet or an apartment at the top of Trump Towers, God knows why anyone would want to live there, but the aspiration to have a secure life, a life where you're not going to suddenly find yourself ruined because of your medical bills. And I think in doing this, we can make a big distinction between private wealth and public wealth. Public wealth doesn't necessarily have to be state wealth. It can be common wealth, the wealth of the commons. And what we see, and this is following the very interesting work of Mike Davis, what we see here is that there's plenty of room for public luxury. We can have fantastic public parks, wonderful public museums and public galleries, amazing public health services, incredible public education, all sorts of wonderful public spaces which we can all enjoy. But there's far less room for private luxury, because if we all want to have 2-acre gardens with infinity pools in and vast mansions parked in the middle of those gardens and huge cars to drive along the freeway, there's simply not the physical or the ecological space to enable us to do that. But if we pursue instead the idea of public affluence, of public luxury, well, there's plenty of space for everyone in that case. And I believe that that meshes very well with the environmental vision. I've got time now for one more question.
Hello, George. My name is Henrik, and I would like to thank you for taking your time to help us out today. The question I thought of was when you were answering Kenny's question, and you mentioned the fact that the U.S. political and economic system, as well as the UK's political and economic systems, they're insane, and I agree with that point to a certain extent. However, what I thought of was when we look at the Scandinavian economy. I'm from Sweden myself, so I benefit from all the great things that come out of a social democracy. But what I was thinking of was that they're all, without exclusion, propped up on the backs of the third world. What are your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right, and thank you for that. It's a good place to end this, I think, because ours always has to be a global vision as well as a local vision. And while pursuing our particular local communities, we have to do so while being cognizant of the global community to which we belong. And here we have to think globally as well as acting locally, of course. We've always known that for a long time. But in this case, I think it can take some specific forms. Let's scrap the World Trade Organization. Let's scrap the bilateral agreements, and let's have instead a fair trade organization. Corporations can then apply for a license to trade. If you want to trade, fine, you can trade, but here are the rules you have to meet before you trade. Here are the wages you have to pay. Here are the terms and conditions you have to enable for your workers. Here's the union recognition you have to do. Here are the environmental protections that you have to abide by. And if you abide by those, fine, you can trade internationally. You have a license to trade granted by the Fair Trade Organization to trade between nations. Off you go. If you don't do those things, sorry mate, no license. Now, why isn't that just obvious common sense? Surely that is the most common sense approach. If we want a world which is going to be fair for everyone, decent for everyone, I'm not saying no trade. I think that can be of great benefit to poorer nations, but only if it's on fair terms. If it's exploitative trade, it can be of great disbenefit to poorer nations. But we also need, and I think this is one place in which we can apply Keynesian logic very well, we need something like the International Clearing Union that he proposed, which is this sort of automated system for balancing trade surpluses and deficits so that no one country falls into impossible debt which can't be repaid. As we saw, the massive debt crisis brought down so many countries in the 1980s and the 1990s, or basically made them beholden to the rich nations in the West because of the trouble that they got into, greatly reducing their chances of democracy, as well as the prospects for the poor people within those nations. Well, so we need some sort of international balancing system, I believe, but we also need democracy at the global level, because at the moment we have global governance, but nothing resembling global democracy. We've got the IMF, we've got the World Bank, which are controlled exclusively by the rich nations, operate almost exclusively in the poor nations. So there's a form of colonial rule. We've got the United Nations, which claims to be a community of nations, but is entirely dominated by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And even the UN General Assembly is controlled by governments without any reference to their people whatsoever. So maybe we need to take a massive leap of the imagination and call for a directly elected world parliament. You know, this is the scale on which I believe we need to start thinking. You know, we can't compartmentalize our concerns and say, well, our self-interest in this corner of the United States or this corner of the United Kingdom is we're going to do this and that's going to be good for our people and to hell with everybody else. That's no longer an option. We have to think like a world. Climate change demands that we think like a world, and we all have to think like citizens of the world. Thank you.
Top one. George, thank you so much. If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to ask the students that organized this to come up so you can get a kind of look at them, and so we can wave to you and thank you. So if you bear with me 1 second, we're going to turn the camera here. Top one. Yep. Everyone up here. So the group is kind of circling in here. Still coming. There's quite a group. So thank you again for all you've done for us today, and on behalf of the group. I promised I might ask you one possible favor, and we totally understand if it's not possible, but with your wonderful voice and ideas, if maybe say something in The Guardian about this experience. I mean, we're talking about, and I think you'll share, in my opinion, that starting a conversation about critical thinking and trying to create a model for something they're calling critical thinking communities. I don't know if you got a chance to see the digital animation or the website, but that's kind of their goal, is to create a model of critical thinking communities that they would like to see spread across the globe based on local affinities. And they hope that this starts the conversations that we had here with you today, but on a global level, and then network them. We'd love it if you'd mention this sometime in the Guardian and give a shout out to these amazing students. So.
Well, people usually go to some lengths not to appear in one of my columns.
We'll change the terms.
Yeah, I mean, look, if it fits in, then yeah, I mean, what you're doing is great work. Like, it's really great, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you all. And thanks for having me on, and thank you for your organising, and thank you for what you're doing for everybody. So yeah, keep at it. Great work, guys.
Thank you.
Take care, man. Thank you.
Cheers. Many thanks indeed.
Bye.
Okay. Yeah.